In conversation with Jane Kirkpatrick. Jane Kirkpatrick is a New York Times and CBA bestselling and award-winning author of more than 40 books, including Beneath the Bending Skies, A Light in the Wilderness, The Memory Weaver, This Road We Traveled, and A Sweetness to the Soul, which won the prestigious Wrangler Award from the Western Heritage Center. Her works have won the WILLA Literary Award, the Carr Award for Historical Fiction, and five Will Rogers Gold Medallion Awards. Jane divides her time between Central Oregon and California with her husband, Jerry, and Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, Rupert. Learn more at jkbooks.com. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure, joy and excitement to have on the show today, Jane Kirkpatrick. How are you doing today, Jane?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for including me in your gallery of wonderful authors and interviews that you've
Uh,
done.
uh,
It's such
uh,
a great, yeah,
Absolute. I love the word gallery of auto interview.
yeah.
Sounds very lovely to me, really. That's a lovely description. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to have you
My
on the show
pleasure.
today.
Yeah.
So, Jen, I need to first say that I was totally impressed by your bodies of amazing literature works. I mean, you've authored 39 novels so far, and you have won 40, and you have the 40th one upcoming on the 20th of May this year. I would like us to talk about how this makes you feel, knowing that you've had another book coming soon. I would like you to tell us a bit about the upcoming book, Across the Crying Sand, whose title I found to be very idiomatic and quite uncommon, even in the literature space. Yeah, I would like you to tell us what inspired this new series, as well as how you feel being in the number 40 of authored works.
Most of the stories I have written have been based on the lives of actual historical women
Mm.
and their circle of family and friends. And I usually do pretty intense research, and then I talk to descendants if I can find them and
Oh.
ask about the family stories, because the stories that get handed down, I think, are as powerful, if not more powerful, than the things that might get written down. And
Mm.
so this particular, I'd sort of decided I'd retired 2 years ago. It was after COVID, and we were selling our home, and my husband had a lot of health issues. And I thought, well, I think I'm done with writing.
Wow.
And about 15 years before that, I
Yeah.
was at a signing for a book I had written, and a woman came up to me and said, I think this should be your next story. And
Mm.
it was a story about this woman, Mary Goretzky, who was the first person to deliver the mail, a very common sort of activity today, but at that time it was very dangerous.
Mm.
And she was the first woman to ever do it on the North Oregon coast. And I kind of put it away and thought, oh well, somebody else will write that book. That's not necessarily my story to tell.
Mm.
But after I retired, this woman returned in my life, and she said, now is the time for you to write this story.
Mm.
And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's probably not one book, it's going to be three books.
Wow.
And it's going to not just talk, Mary's story will anchor the series, but it will really be about a number of other women who made their way in a very difficult terrain, um,
Mm.
and and inspired the people around them and their families. So that's sort of the background. And this particular
Wow.
woman, her name is Susie. She was a wizard on the computer and a wonderful research assistant, and has just been an anchor for me in
Mm.
telling this story about a place that I have never lived. And
Mm.
I always have to find someone. I call them my brokers. They're my landscape brokers. They're my cultural brokers. They're people I can
Mm.
go to say, if you're living on the coast, how does this affect you? Since I've never lived on a coast. So
Yeah,
I hope that adds authenticity to the storytelling.
that sounds to me to be quite beautiful, quite awesome, and quite lovely. And I love your description of that, really. I love your story around that of Mary and that of Susie. And now I know that you've
Yeah.
written extensively about pioneering women in history. How does Mary's story differ from or complement your other historical heroines, if in any way?
I think it complements the other women I've written about because these are four threads that
Yeah,
always run through them,
yeah,
my stories, and they're the landscape and how people dealt with their landscape, the importance of different relationships,
yeah,
including relationships with people that are what I call everyday people, people that we don't think about necessarily having an impact on us, and yet they
mm,
do.
absolutely.
The third thread is the spirituality. Where do people draw their strength from?
Mm,
And the fourth thread is the work that they did, and
mm,
how did the work define them? And so for Mary, that was part of, those are the four threads that I tried to weave together in this story. And if you read my other stories, you'll find those same four threads.
mm,
How she differs, I think, is that she took a very unusual path to get to be a postal deliverer, in that she
mm,
was married very young. She and her husband was from the Netherlands, and he had left his home when he was 16 and jumped ship in Astoria, Oregon,
mm.
and went at night. He learned English. He studied as a was a farmer, and he met Mary, and they married when she was 16 and
Wow,
had four children very quickly.
wow.
And the instead of the family, many of the women I write about, their family was part of their strength. And for
Mm,
Mary,
mm,
her family drained her of that strength.
mm,
And so I was wanting to explore what did she draw her strength from then,
mm.
and how did she manage to keep her family together and yet find her own purpose in her own life.
I love the fact that you mentioned, I think this is a very beautiful and lovely story of how they differ, and how they were able to complement other historical urine in other writing. Because you mentioned that for other people, their family were part of their strength. But just for
Mm-hmm.
Mary's case, a family were draining her strength. It wasn't part, and she had to look for other way to catch up with the strength that she has. I think that's a lovely description, really, and I can really relate with the story of Mary. Quite beautiful. Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing.
So there is a wonderful poet and writer named Kim Stafford here in America,
Mm.
and he wrote a book called. It was about the death by suicide of his younger brother,
Oh, wow.
and he was writing 20 years later, and he talked about a time in our life when he called it being in the cellar of sorrow, and he
Mm.
said it's a mark of our character how we climb up the ladder out of that cellar towards some sort of light, no
Mm.
matter how dim nor strange.
Mm.
And so, what I'm finding that became for me a metaphor of what are the rungs of the ladder
Mm.
that we use as human beings, and that these women used 150 years ago,
Mm.
and that are they still the rungs of the ladder that we can incorporate in our life today.
Mm.
So, and
Mm.
family is certainly one of them.
It's one of them. It's one of them. Absolutely one of
Yeah.
them. I love your take on this, yeah. And I wanted to ask you, can you tell us about the real life historical figure who inspired Mary's character, if there is any of that nature, and also the relationship between Mary and John Garrett represent a strong partnership in homesteading. What historical sources helped you craft their dynamics?
I do think that they were very close to each other. He was about 8 years older than Mary and certainly had a different level of experience. My husband is 16 years older than me,
Mm.
and we've been married for 49 years. But
Amazing.
in those early years, I had to, and he did too, adjust to, I might have been going through some stress, and he, having been 16 years older, might say, "Oh, I've been there, done that." And so I said, "Yes, you are older and you've had experiences, but they're not my experience." And so, what I need from you when I'm stressed is not for you to try to fix it, but to walk beside me and help me get through it on my own,
Yeah.
knowing you are there. And I do think that that was part of John and Mary's journey. Uh,
Mm.
and homesteading at that time was uh, people had to come up with unique solutions to make a living.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was on the Oregon coast. It's very wet and rainy. The soil is not great for gardening, for example.
Mm.
So food and just everyday resources were important. And John often had to take work away from the farm that they had, the
Mm.
homestead that they had. And
Yeah.
sometimes he was gone 3 months at a time.
Imagine.
And I do think about that for contemporary couples whose spouses might be living in another city during the week and then coming back,
Yeah.
or deployed for military purposes, and so they're separated. And we have the luxury of a Zoom, and can communicate.
You
And they
know.
didn't have that. Yeah, they didn't have that. So that was another huge challenge, I would say, for
Mm.
and part of the dynamics that I think for them and for many couples is that they begin to see a challenge not as an example of that somebody messed up or made a mistake, but as an opportunity to take another look at, okay, here we are. How did we get here? Sort
Yeah.
of increase our curiosity, but
Mm.
also increase our compassion,
Yeah.
because we're all in the same team.
Mm.
And sometimes we forget that as people who work together, whether it's in a corporate setting or whether it's, in a romantic setting,
Mm.
that sometimes we have to remind each other, hey, it's not helpful for you to yell at me because I missed that turn. We're
Yeah.
both trying to get to the same place.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah,
I love the fact that you had to tell us a bit story into, your stress days, back then and how your husband reacted to it. That's quite lovely to know as well. And also, Jane, there
thank you.
is one of your titles that I found to be quite compelling, and that's the one titled A Light in the Wilderness. For readers who haven't
Yes.
read that yet, and without giving much information away, I would like you to tell us about some of the themes and subject lines, overarching themes that that would be reader would experience picking up a light in the wilderness.
I have to share with you how that story came into my life.
Yeah.
Letitia Carson is the woman who I wrote about, and she was an African American woman who was brought from Nigeria and was in Kentucky and enslaved,
Mm.
and then was given her freedom and came west on in the 1840s with in the company of her common law husband, and that was someone, because people of different races weren't allowed to marry, but they
Mm.
were a committed couple.
Yeah.
And she made an impact on her white neighbors in the life she had here in Oregon.
Wow.
And many years later, a century later, there were two students at Oregon State University who were researching something totally different. And
Wow.
they came upon court records of this African American woman who had brought two lawsuits. And it was at a time when a person of color was not allowed to bring a lawsuit. They were not
Mm.
allowed to testify against a white person.
Mm.
They were in the territory, and actually there were exclusion clauses that said that you can only be here for 6 months if you're not property of someone else, and you
Wow.
have to leave. And she did not leave,
Wow.
and so there were these remarkable situations about this African American woman, and they
Mm.
began to do research. And then they brought their research to me and said, there are a lot of gaps. A nonfiction or a biography tells what someone did and when they did it,
Yeah.
but a novel allows you to explore, why did they do that? What were
Mm.
they doing there? And
Absolutely.
to explore the feelings of that.
Yeah.
How did they feel? How were they affected?
Mm.
So they said, we think this story needs to have someone who will look at what was her motivation, why did she do what she
What
did,
does she do?
and
Absolutely.
how did she feel about that.
Yeah.
So and the remarkable, I mean, is that she won both of those lawsuits, and the theme of that story is her strength, her creativity,
Mm.
her ability to engage the white people who were basically having to carry her case. And she
Yeah.
had a jury. The jury were all men, white men, many of
Wow.
them from the South, and still they gave her the win. And
Mm.
I think she had to have been a very remarkable woman to have been, to have brought that forth. And she never behaved as a victim, even though she was wrongfully treated, which was why she brought the lawsuits. And these happened after her husband Davy died, and she had by then they had two children, and she never behaved as a victim. She went forward, and I think that's another thing about people who are hardy, or the people that we look for in their strengths, is that she
Mm.
didn't spend time in blame or accusing, not
Yeah.
because she couldn't win, but because that keeps you from your commitments. It keeps
Absolutely.
you, it gets you caught. And so
Mm.
she never let herself be caught. She took her chances on these lawsuits and she won. She left the region and went to another part of Oregon where
Mm.
she is still revered. There's a river named after her. People remember her, and now there is a school named after her in Oregon. And
Mm.
there's, I mean, she just, her story resonates with so many of us about
Mm.
doing what you can do despite the challenges that you are faced with, and doing
Absolutely.
it in a way that inspires other people. So it was a great story before I ever had the privilege of trying to write it down.
Wow. Oh, wow. I love your description of this, really. It sounds to me to be quite amazing, quite interesting, and very wholesome. And I love the emotion, your excitement talking about it, really.
Yeah.
Now, I want us to go back now to Oregon Coast. The Oregon Coast Crying Sand were known for their treacherous condition. Can you share more about the unique challenges mail carrier faced on this route? How did your research into 1880s Oregon coastal life influence the development of your characters and setting? I would much love to know more about that.
The description of the this particular place of the Oregon coast,
Yeah.
it's about 7 miles of a uh, very calm beach with some
Wow.
big chunks of rocks. I don't know if you can see that this is
Yeah.
actually,
Beautiful cover, even.
these rocks. This is called Haystack Rock. And
Mm.
at that time, there were very few roads inland because it was such a rugged terrain. Very, very tall spruce trees and fir trees, brambles and brushes and mountains. And so people moved along the coast, along the beach to get to from a populated area like Astoria to this particular spot on the beach. It took hours because there was no road. You had to go through it. You couldn't even bring a horse. You had to walk it. And the native people had lived there for years. They were Nehalem, Chinook, Tillamook people. And when you walk to this on this beach, the sand makes a funny sound. It has a little squeaky sound,
Mm.
and the native people refer to that as a crying sound. People were crying, and
Mm.
they told the story of, I'm not sure what the word they would have had, but it was a tsunami from the 1790s.
Mm.
And when a tsunami happens, the tide goes way out, and the women went out with the tide to dig for clams and look for mussels and so on,
Mm.
and did not know that what would happen next would be that terrible wall of water would come back. And
Mm.
when the wall of water came back, many, many, many of the women of those tribes died. And
Wow.
so the survivors refer to this as that the sand is crying for those lost
Mm.
lives. So that's where the title comes,
Oh,
and
wow.
it gives you some sense of the unpredictability of the landscape. You know, that you had to know the tides because you didn't want to be on that beach when the tide was coming in, that it would wash in logs, which could, trip you. There were sneaker waves that the ocean would look calm, and then suddenly there would be this wave that would come out of nowhere. And even today, with the weather service, will announce, this is, you be wary of the sneaker waves today because the seas are roiling in a way that it's hard to see from the surface.
Mm.
In addition, so if you couldn't walk on the beach, you had to go inland, and that was up and over a mountain. There was a mountain in this story called Miakani Mountain that had an 800-foot drop, and had meadows and so on as you moved up. But there was a section to go around the mountain that was only as wide as two palms. And so horses had to be very, very sure-footed, we would say, to be able to make that trail. And that was part of Mary's route. She
Mm.
would have the mail bags would be on her horse, Prince or Jake. She had a couple of horses, and she would get off at that point, and they would follow her around. And you didn't
Mm.
want to meet anybody coming from the other section because that was a major trial. Generally, even when the path widened, it wasn't very wide. And
Mm.
stories are told of having to dismantle wagons and push the parts up against the interior of the bank and lead people around, and then come back and get the equipment, the wagon box and the wheels and so on, and reestablish it to go on your way. So the mail
Mm.
wasn't always delivered at a particular time because you never knew what the landscape was going to give you.
I love a statement you mentioned. The sand is crying. It sounds to me to be quite poetic in nature, and even the title of your book sounds to be quite dramatic and poetic as well in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I do love that section of it. Quite
So
beautiful.
yes, I think it's I each of the it's a three-book series,
Yeah.
and I start each of the three books with sort of a short prose piece
Mm.
written from the point of view of the native people,
Oh,
to say
wow.
this is part of who we are. This was our place, and these are our people, and these are some of the things that happened here.
Absolutely.
Another sort of intriguing thing is that there were a number of shipwrecks because it's a very rugged coast. And
Mm.
from the very early time period, one of the ships that continues to leave debris, if you want to call it that, was
Yeah.
that it was a Spanish ship, and it carried as ballast beeswax, partly because they needed ballast, but also
Mm.
because the monasteries in California, they wanted the priests to make candles out of beeswax and not the smelly tallow from,
Mm.
the fat of elk and deer and so on. And
Mm.
these chunks of beeswax show up at various times.
Oh,
And
wow.
in Mary's time, she and her father would find big chunks, and then they could sell them and make a little money because they would get melted down and to be able to make candles and
Mm.
other things out of them. So I always like that image as well, the beeswax.
Wow, that's lovely as well. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning. And also, Jane, many of your books feature strong women who take unconventional paths. I mean, quite
Mm-hmm.
unconventional path, which is quite amazing. Then why do you think these stories continue to resonate with modern readers? What lessons or takeaway do you hope that readers will gain from reading your books?
I think part of it is that because they're based on real people,
Mm. Oh.
that contemporary readers can say, well, my life is very complicated right now, and it feels like this is never going to get better. But
Mm.
Mary must have felt that too, or
Yeah,
Letitia must have felt that too. And they
absolutely.
did get through it. And so I think it's, the word inspire or inspirational means the act of breathing in. We inspire, we take something. And I like to think of it as we are taking something in for the long haul.
Mm.
That my hope is that my books give to readers something they can take in
Yeah.
that will help sustain them for the
Mm.
long haul, for what
Absolutely.
for what we have to face tomorrow, for the wreckage of things that are happening around us in our
Mm.
world. That they can take some richness out of the lives of ordinary people
Mm.
who also faced very difficult trials, and
Mm.
how they navigated through that.
Wow, that's
So
amazing. That's lovely. And your response to that, I want to make me to go now to diversify a little bit into the topic, into the topic of readers' feedbacks. Yeah, because one of the things that amazes me about writing is to sit back and listen to readers' feedback. And you may want to agree with me that one of the things that makes literature to be a bit complex is the fact that it can be interpreted in different ways by different people based on their opinions. And sometimes some readers may get a message intended by the author. Sometimes it might be close to getting the message. Sometimes it might be far from getting the message, say maybe some several miles or kilometers away from getting the message. And on some other occasion, they might hilariously misunderstand the book and interpret it upside down. And as interestingly fun as they sound, I wanted to ask you, especially as someone who has written a lot in, the genre of women, etc., exploring a lot in this category, how do you feel when readers interpret your works differently than you intended, be it male or female readers, or if in any way you've ever experienced that, how does it make you feel as a writer?
I always say the reader is right.
Oh, okay.
However they were touched or moved by it, they're right. That they took that from it. The author of Passages to India, he
Yeah.
said, "Give me in a story, and you'll have a reader for life."
Oh,
And
wow.
so part of what I'm hopeful is that I make a connection, and it might be on the theme, it might be what I thought the story was about, but I have heard from readers. I spoke at a historical society some years ago, and a man and his wife had driven over 100 miles to come to this event.
That's
And he said, "It was my birthday present." And
wow.
he said, "I've read all of your books." And he said, "I feel like I was born 100 years too late. That these people are," he said, "you've given me a community." And,
Mm,
what a gift for a writer to sort of provide for this man a
mm,
sense of he could find himself
mm,
inside these stories. Other men who dealt with life the way he hoped he did, who were good people, who, managed to, they didn't make $1 million. They were not super wealthy. They were
yeah.
just everyday, reliable, faithful men.
Mm,
And so I've had people tell me this one was quite a surprise to me. In one of the books, The Sweetness to the Soul, I
mm,
had given a dog that's in the story the name Pig
wow.
because we had a black lab dog that had little short ears, and we called him Mr. Pig. He just had a
Mm,
little pig look. And I gave the name of the main character. I was
yeah.
looking for an English sounding name,
Oh, wow.
and Bacon was the name I picked. Her name was Maisie Bacon. And it never made any connection to me until a reader came up to me and said, "Did you know that you called your dog Pig, and his owner was Bacon?" And I had never made that. And I said, "No, I never made that connection."
you know.
So, they read something there that I hadn't planned, but it was
Such
something
a
maybe,
coincidence.
subconsciously, yeah, a
Yeah,
coincidence. So,
coincidence.
yeah,
You can imagine.
yeah. So, and I think one of the more gratifying things is when people say, "I never thought of it that way." until
Mm.
I read your book.
Yeah.
And that to me makes it very interactive. I mean, aren't you happy when when you know you've
Yes.
sort of opened a little portal
Mm.
to another reader's world?
Yeah.
So, and Mary Oliver, who's a wonderful poet, and I love her work, she has a poem called Praying, which I think is really written for writers. And one
Mm.
of the lines in there is just patch a few words together. It's not a contest, it's a door that you open into which another voice may speak.
Mm.
And sometimes it's my voice that someone hears when they read the book, and sometimes
Mm.
it's another voice. Maybe
Absolutely.
it's from their past, or maybe it's a spiritual voice that
Absolutely.
allows them to feel safe enough to think a little differently about something that maybe they have not thought about it before.
Oh wow, that was so amazing, so emotional and very lovely. I love your take on that. And I think this is one of the beauty of writing, the way, the stance with which readers can see themselves, a reflection of their life, random authors writing, and they'll be like, oh
Right.
wow, that resonates so well with me. Oh wow, I can relate so much with your character.
Mm-hmm.
Oh wow, that speaks a lot to me. I think it's one of those lovely feeling that always makes that is very satisfactory, really, for a writer. To
Yes,
me,
that's a
it
good
is
word. Yes,
it is very
yes, yes,
satisfactory. Like, oh my
yes,
goodness, if not for anything, if this is all I get from this, I am
yes,
satisfied. You
yes,
understand?
yes,
This is
exactly,
this is all I
exactly. Yes,
receive. I
yes,
am satisfied. And I
yes,
love your statement where you mention, give me in your story, and you've
yes,
had a reader for life. I had to write that down. It is very lovely, such a very
yes,
potent and strong
yes,
word that I think every writer should have stick to their wall. I remember to look at whenever they are crafting
yes,
their
yes.
stories in order to leave an indelible mark in the heart of their readers. Very important.
And there's another line that I have that has struck me from Kafka, that who said that a story should be an axe to the frozen sea within us,
Oh
that
wow.
it should which should crack us open. And I love that image as well. That's what stories do, that they are very powerful. And
Mm,
I think, stories are like a spark that lights our ancestors' lives. And then they're the embers that we blow on to illuminate our own life. That's part of what stories do. And
yes.
and that's why I like to listen to the stories of the descendants of the people I write about,
Mm,
because that's the ember that they're blowing on. They remember their grandmother said this or their
mm,
grandfather thought that, and that, so they're blowing on that ember
mm.
to help understand their own stories.
I really love this. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And it's my
And I wanted to
pleasure.
ask you a very, I would say, kind of funny question, more like you're asking a mother of all the children you've given birth to, which is your favorite? I mean, who do you love most? Because this can be very challenging if you picked one and the other kids were like, are you trying to tell me, mom, that you don't like me? Or what
Yeah.
do you mean by that? So I wanted to ask you, of all the books you've authored, of a trunkload of 40 you've had so far, do you have a favorite? Do you have a particular one that stood out mostly with you that you love so dearly over others? If so, why?
My favorite is always the one I'm working on now, the story that is engaging me right now.
Interesting.
But I have to say that every one of the people that I have been privileged to write about,
Yeah.
I always thought it was a story about XXX, this woman who did this. And when I finish the book, I'm always surprised by the insight that I sort of have to sit back and go, oh, that's what this story had to teach me.
Hmm.
And so every one of them, my husband's favorite book is the first one called The Sweetness to the Soul.
Wow.
And it was about a couple, and they were trying to make a life at a time. And my husband and I had left our suburban world and were trying to homestead in a very remote area. So there were lots of parallels. But I didn't know, one of the themes of that story was she was childless. And my editor, when I finished the first draft, said to me, you haven't really resolved the question of whether she wanted to have children and couldn't have them, or
Mm,
whether she was a woman of a period where children were expected, but she wasn't particularly, that was not her route. And
mm,
so I went back to the drawing board and had it be a story of which she wanted to have children but couldn't have them. And what
mm,
I didn't realize when I wrote that, I had not been able to have children, and
mm,
I thought I had dealt with that pretty well.
mm,
But it wasn't until I sort of grieved with this character in the
mm,
journey that I realized that that was part of the healing for me. It was in
mm.
writing this story.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I'd have to say that every single book, The Memory Weaver, one of the stories that came out of that for me was the power of memory. Between story and history
Yeah.
lies memory.
Yeah.
And our memories are, they read like a story. You know, we did this and then we did that, but they claim us like history. We
Mm,
think that that's the way it happened. And so
mm,
that's why families get into terrible disagreements because we don't remember the details. We remember the experience and
mm,
how it affected
mm,
us. And
mm.
that particular story taught me
Wow.
about that memories are not meant to hold us hostage. They're meant to transform us. They're meant to be brought into the present to nurture us in some way and not to harm us. And I needed that in my life at that time as I was dealing with some memories that were not helpful, not healthy.
Mm,
And so you could ask me any one of these titles, and I would be able to tell you what the I thought the book was about. But once I was in the revisions and finished it, I realized, okay, this is what it was saying, how it was speaking to me. And it might
mm,
not speak to anyone else that way at all, but it was how it spoke to me. So
mm.
it's hard for me to choose because they all,
Yeah.
little children that they are, gave me something I didn't expect.
I mean, even from your answers, I can imagine that it's really very hard to choose because there's always a message. Before a writer could sit down and craft a book to start working on it, he or she has a message in his heart he wanted to
Yeah,
share. And the
yeah,
process of sitting down to start the book on itself shows that, yeah, there's a message here. And for you, someone like you, have got like 40 so far, there's always a message in one book and the other, one book and the other, one book and the other, transferring from one to another, etc. And I love the fact that you mentioned that, between stories and histories lies memories. And these memories are not meant to hold us in hostage. They are meant to transform us. That's a beautiful statement you've got in there. And from your response, so I find it to be quite lovely that it's kind of tempting for me to ask that, do your experience so far influence your writing in any way? Maybe your work or your relationship or your family or anything. Is there any bit of your life experiences in any way in your writing, in any way in any of your books, etc.? If it's something you love to talk about
I think as writers, whether we intend it to or not,
or
if
not?
we bring our whole self, we're going to bring some of those experiences. With the very first novel that I wrote,
Sweetness to the
because there were
soul.
some, yes, and
Yeah.
because there were these parallels, that her husband was 16 years older than her, and that's our age difference between my husband and I. And they had no children, and we had no children of our own. And they
Mm,
were trying to build a life in a remote area and so on. So there were these parallels. And
mm,
so I gave myself the task of writing like a biographical timeline for her of important events. And
mm,
then I did that for myself up to that age. I was probably 47 at that point when I did
oh,
that. And because I didn't want to write my biography into her life, I wanted her life to be celebrated
yeah,
and explored on
yeah,
its own. So I think I was always conscious of that, but I also think that if we are authentic as writers,
yeah.
that we can't stand off to the side of our story and sort of
Mm,
tell it. We're if we're going to show it, we are going to feel some of those same feelings that we are asking our characters to
Yeah,
experience.
absolutely.
And so I know that, my some of my fears, some of my anxieties, some of my frustrations, all of those have
Mm.
come and show up,
Oh,
in some of
wow.
these characters. And hopefully I'm not doing my therapy there, not writing. I actually will go see a therapist for these various issues. But I do think that writing is very therapeutic,
Yeah, it is.
even if you never get it published. I think that
Mm.
there's a gift, and actually there's some scientific evidence that
Yeah.
the act of writing increases the T cells in our blood, and
Mm.
the T cells are the ones that are the immune system. They fight off infection. So,
Mm.
and that's something that I can do to keep myself healthy,
Yeah.
is to write about just everyday experiences. That's why people journal, I think, because
Yeah.
there is a healing quality to that. So,
Yeah, I think it's very therapeutic. I was in a creative event last week Tuesday, and some of the things other people were talking about is the fact that how they find escape in writing, how they find identity in writing, how they find joy in writing, in expressing their art, either in drawing format, or in sculpture format, or in painting, or in storytelling, or in poetry or in drawing in different ways. It's very releasing. It's a release of the emotion, a release of the unseen baggages they have in their head, carrying that other people cannot see. A release to the wound, a
mhm.
healing medicine to the pain and the wound and the heart and other. It's just so amazing how I sat down and listening to other different creative think and say what they think of writing, what writing means to them, what creativity means to them. And it's quite very beautiful, really. And I love your response to these messages, to these
Mhm.
questions. It's quite lovely and very wholesome for me. Thank you very much for sharing
Well,
with us.
I have um, another thing I hang on to is that the Greek word for comfort
Yeah.
means to walk along beside. And
Mm.
I think that's what literature does for
Yeah.
people, is it comes along beside us. It doesn't try to hit you over the head. It doesn't try to
Mm.
proselytize. It says, let me walk beside you.
Uh,
And there's comfort in that.
there's
So
comfort in that. That's a huge
yeah.
comfort in that. Thank you. This is so lovely. I love this conversation. Yeah, before we wrap
Thank
up for
you.
today, I wanted to ask you, what sort of advice would you give? I mean, for someone like you who has written and published 40 novels so far, what sort of advice would you give other writers who are still struggling with writing and publishing a book? And also, where exactly can readers connect with you and get a copy of some of your books from?
So on my website, which is just
Yeah.
jkbooks.com, I have a section there for writers, sort of writing tips, things to consider and think for aspiring writers.
Yeah.
But one of the main things I tell people is to listen to your story.
Mm.
Don't write to the market. Don't write to, oh, right now things are really, certain kinds of stories. Don't write to that. Write to what the story is trying to tell you, and that keeps you emotionally connected to it.
Mm.
If you're writing what the story is going, as opposed to being anxious about, well, who is going to buy this, and what, I call it silencing the harpies that sit behind us and say, what are you
Mm.
doing? You don't know how to write. Forget this. You got other things to do. So you have to put duct tape, I call it, putting duct tape on the harpies.
Yeah.
But a very practical suggestion that I have on the website and that I would encourage new writers is from a book called Structuring Your Novel by Robertson Fitzgerald. The last names John,
Yeah.
and I forget the guys. But they have a practice, which is a practice I do before I write any of my books, and it's answering three questions. And
Oh,
the
wow.
first question is, what's my intention? Which is sort
Yes.
of the elevator. What's the story about?
Mm.
And I
The
might
why.
take many pages to answer that, but I try to get them into one sentence each. And I'll tell you why at the end.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
second question is, what is my attitude towards this story? And
Mm,
the corollary to that is, what do I feel deeply about?
mm,
What is it that is the emotional draw for me in this story? And
mm,
the third question is, what is my purpose? And the corollary to that is, how do I hope a reader might be changed? You
mm.
know, and so I'll write like crazy, and I try to get those answers into three one sentence, um, one sentence each. And
Mm,
I print those out and I stick them on the top of my computer.
mm.
And then when I get lost in the middle of the writing,
Look at
I
it.
can look up there and say, what is this story about? Why are you giving your life to this story? What do you feel so deeply about?
Mm,
And how do you hope a reader will be changed? And in
mm.
that process, I can get back on track. I don't
Wow.
get go off onto rabbit trails about, what color did Crayola have in 1880? It doesn't really matter. But
Yeah,
because I like research, it's sort of fun. But it
yeah,
keeps you from, yeah, keeps you from finishing. So
absolutely.
I highly recommend that book and that practice. It was
Mm,
an early editor of mine, Rob Morris, gave me that book and suggested, and it was such a great book for me to focus on how I wanted to tell these stories. So I would encourage that. But the most important thing, I think, is to listen to the story.
yeah.
I get people who say to me, you should write this story about my great great grandmother. She was the first, yada, yada, yada. And I always say, if that story calls my name, I know that I would learn something about myself I otherwise never would have learned.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't learn what you would learn
Yeah.
because you're the keeper of that story. And that
Mm,
story is tapping you on the shoulder. And don't tell me you don't know how to write, because that story wants you to be the one to write it down, and
absolutely.
trust that. And I've never been disappointed. I've had people get back to me and say, I am so glad I did that. I'm
Mm,
so glad that I tried to write my aunt's story down or whatever. I learned so much about her and about myself in the process. And some of them have gone
absolutely.
on to be published, and some of them, they were just pieces that they will hand down to their family.
I love your answers to this and I love your advice. It's so amazing and I can learn. I mean, it's a lovely feeling. Everything you've mentioned so far, it's like a learning curve for me. And I'm hoping that viewers, even including myself, would love to utilize it. And I also left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Jane Kirkpatrick book directly on Amazon and Barnes& and Nobles on our website and also on other platforms. I also left link to our social media pages for possible followings. So thank you so much, Jane, for accepting the invitation to be featured on P English Literature. I'm also this conversation is more than awesome, very great, quite educative, quite emotional,
Thank
quite
you.
lovely into getting to know about your characterization, your characters, your book titles, why you wrote them, and the storyline behind them. Thank you very much for coming on, and this is really impressive. I love it
Yeah,
wholeheartedly.
thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
it's my pleasure as well.